Tony McAleer, thanks so much for coming on to Talk Beliefs all the way from Vancouver, Canada. You are an international speaker and co-founder of the non-profit organization Life After Hate, which aims to help people who have been involved in hate groups. You yourself were once involved in a white supremacist neo-Nazi organization, the White Aryan Resistance, and now work to help people to leave similar groups and to make better, more compassionate lives for themselves. So how are you doing, Tony? How are things way over there in Vancouver?
Pretty good. It's morning here, and everybody's socially distancing and staying COVID safe and all of that. But Vancouver is one of the most beautiful cities in the world, so I wouldn't trade it for anything.
Absolutely. I've been there twice, and I was amazed at how clean it was.
No, it's a very clean, great city to grow up in, and it's strange to imagine that such an environment could have produced the likes of me in the bad days.
Well, before we get into your story of joining and exiting a white supremacist group, let's just hear a bit about your background. A lot of your early life was right here in the UK. Was there anything about your time here that perhaps contributed to your eventual alignment with the White Aryan Resistance in Canada?
Absolutely. And I'm just going to dial it back to, I was born in England, grew up in Vancouver, and went back and forth, spent months in the summer every year in England and such. And so it absolutely did play a key role. And my father, who was a psychiatrist, I grew up in an affluent neighborhood, upper middle class, private schools and such. I didn't come from a broken home. I didn't come from a working class home or neighborhood. And, my father, they say there's nothing more English than an Englishman abroad. And that was sort of the epitome of my father. You couldn't get any good ale in Canada, so he brewed his own English ale, and he created he had a bar that was like an English pub with a copper top and barrels and all the bar mirrors that you would see in a pub in the 70s, and he'd have his English friends over to drink English beer and talk about English things, and so that sense of British identity sort of rubbed off on me. And, when I was 10, I got up in the middle of the night to get a glass of Ribena. I had a sore, scratchy throat, and my mom was a flight attendant, and she was away for overnight for the first time. And I went down to the fridge and tried to, sometimes when it gets sticky, it's hard to open, and I couldn't open the bottle. And, I heard music from downstairs in the bar, and I walked down the stairs to get my dad to help me to open it. And it wasn't unusual for my dad to have friends over drinking late and stuff. And I looked through the window into the room, and there he was with another woman that wasn't my mom, and she wasn't wearing any clothes. And that really, really rocked me. And the anger, the shame, confusion, in situations like that, or in divorces, sometimes we blame ourselves. What wasn't I not good enough, that and that type of thing, that you wouldn't want to keep the family together. The family stayed together in the end anyways. But that set the tone that took me from being an A and a B student to being a C and a D student. And going to all boys Catholic school. By the time the next year rolled around, and I was 11 at this point, getting C's and D's when I should be getting A's and B's, my parents and the teachers got together, and they agreed that they would try and beat the grades into me. And if I didn't get an A or a B in major tests and assignments, I was marched down the hall and had to go to the teacher's office and get hit on the rear end, get caned every time that happened. And if I think back now, I think even to this day, I don't think I ever felt more powerless than I did in that office over and over and over again. And by the time I was 14, I sort of went down this path of passive aggressive resistance against all the authority figures in my life. And, the school said to my parents, there's not any one thing he's done that's worthy of expulsion, but his general level of defiance is sort of a pain in the ass, and we've had enough. We've tried everything. It's not changing. So take him somewhere else and we won't expel him. That somewhere else was boarding school in England. And at Scarborough College up in the Northeast, seaside resort, if you can call such a thing on the North Sea, it's seaside resort.
After a fashion.
Yeah. But there I was 15. I'd had enough of Catholic school. They'd sort of beaten the Catholicism out of me. There was a seaside resort with a promenade and all the lights and bells and whistles and arcades, and it was a co-ed boarding school. I chose Scarborough for no other reasons than those simplest reasons, and being one of two Catholics with an Irish last name at a Methodist boarding school full of British Army kids was maybe not, in hindsight, the smartest idea, and so that only lasted a year. But on the weekends, I would go and travel to my grandfather's house in St. Helens, and it was there that the kids that I'd spent summers with every year, were same age as me, and some of them were skinheads, or they had older brothers who everybody feared and respected and looked up to, were skinheads, and that's where I first came into contact with the skinhead thing, because what had happened to me is before walking in on my dad, I was listening to Elton John and Queen and music like that. By the next year when I'm getting beaten at school, I'm listening to The Clash and the Sex Pistols, and as my anger in me really changed, it was reflected in the music I was listening to, and so I was listening to a lot of punk, but then I started listening to some of the skinhead music, oi music, and such, and I really vibed with me, and part of the attraction for me was it was a way to false bond with my father, right? So my father was ultra British, and if you think back to the early days of skinheads, they were ultra nationalistic, jingoistic, and wearing Union Jack shirts, and they drank ale, and it was all about drinking and fighting and football hooliganism and going to football matches. And so my dad was always watching English soccer, always drinking ale. He was, uber British when he wasn't being Irish. It was kind of this. He had two personalities depending on what suited him best. And so it was even though my dad was horrified that I was getting, that I was later on, as I started to get into the skinhead thing, and I was trying to bond with him, to curry his favor, his attention, his approval. And, growing up, he was a psychiatrist who worked 60, 70, 80 hours a week. And often I was in bed before he even got home. So I know he loved us, and his way of doing that was to be a fantastic provider. But as a little boy, what I needed, what I craved the most, was his attention and his time. Mm. And so we do these psychological things, like we'll do things that align with our parents, or we do the exact opposite in a way to make us more likable at a subconscious level. And that's certainly what I did. And he'd grown up in the Catholic slums of Liverpool, by the docks, with 5 of them in a 1-bedroom flat. And so he was always very proud of his working class roots. So, how does a middle class kid, end up, getting involved in a working class street scene? It was me identifying with that working class roots that happened. And so you'd always say, middle class income lad, but working class roots. Mm-hmm. And so that was all part of sort of the false bonding thing. But what really drew me to the skinheads is, they were terrifying, and that excited me. And when I went back to Vancouver, and I remember going to my very first punk show, and it was Black Flag with Henry Rollins, and I'm standing outside the venue, and the two skinheads walked by me, and they looked down on my boots and see I'm wearing Doc Martens, which were a dime a dozen in England at the time when I was at boarding school. But they were rare and expensive in Vancouver at the time, and they look at my boots and they look at me, and they look at my boots and look at me, and they go, "What size feet do you have?" And these guys are quite a bit bigger than me, and I knew exactly what they were. And I lied and said my feet were smaller than they were, and they said, no, they wouldn't fit you anyways. And off they walked around the corner, and away they went. Those two guys became my best friends. And my bullying survival strategy was befriend the bully, become the bully. And when I started hanging out with these guys, my parents were like, "I don't get it. Why are you have all these other people you can hang out with. Why are you hanging out with them?" And I think in retrospect, they had the one thing that I didn't, and that was toughness. And they were feared for their capacity for violence. And having spent all those trips to that office when I was 11 and subjected to that absolute powerlessness at the hands of violence, it was something that I craved. And I joined them in, and this is going to sound absolutely strange, I joined them to feel safe. I started hanging around with skinheads to feel safe, because when I was with them, it was completely unsafe place to be, because there was always violence around. But people were afraid of me, not because of me, but because of who I was with. Because, like I said, I wasn't a tough kid growing up, but that fear and notoriety, and that false sense of power that came with it was absolutely intoxicating. And for me to have their protection, I had to have their respect. And for me to have their respect, I had to engage in all the same acts of violence that they did. And I did happily.
Well, after boarding school, you returned home to Vancouver, as you've said, where your life changed when you met members of the White Aryan Resistance. Well, before we dive into your journey in and out of that group, what exactly is the White Aryan Resistance, and what does it stand for?
Well, the White Aryan Resistance was a group founded by Tom Metzger, who actually just passed away last week. Wow. And it was, he had been in the Ku Klux Klan. He'd run for Congress in California and got 70,000 votes running as a Democrat. And they were a group organized, dedicated to the preservation of the white race by any means necessary, and the overthrow of the Zionist occupational government in Washington. Tom Metzger was also a big proponent of leaderless resistance. Mm-hmm. You can't infiltrate a cell of one, and very much about lone wolf activities, act on your own, and was against organized groups per se, and membership lists and mailing lists and such. One of the things he's most famous for was he had a television show, Race and Reason, where in the United States they have a thing called cable access, community access television, and they there's no editorial, they can't turn away a community program. So he, I think in 30 cities, had a weekly or monthly television show that was broadcast on cable access. Race and Reason, it was called.
How much of an audience did it have?
I'm not sure, but you don't get a huge audience on cable access, but just that you have your television show in 30 cities, in a way that made it accessible, anonymously accessible. I think, we can get into that in a bit, how the internet made these movements much more accessible. And so Tom Metzger's philosophy was, if you don't have a criminal record, don't get one, grow your hair out, go to college, join the military, get rank, join the police, get rank, infiltrate society, and to quote Mao, a true revolutionary swims in the sea of the people. And he used to chuckle and say, run silent, run deep, like the infamous film about U-boats. So that was sort of his philosophy. And there was very much there was an organization that came out of Aryan nations known as the Order, and they assassinated a radio talk show host. They robbed an armored car for $3.5 million. The money was never recovered, and the leader of that group ended up dying in a shootout with the FBI, and they used incendiaries to burn the cabin he was in down. So he became a legend and a folk hero of this sort of Second American Revolution. And Tom Metzger was very much behind supporting the spirit of Robert Matthews and the Order. So it was pretty hardcore.
Right. Can you talk now about your time in this white supremacist group? Why did you join, and what happened during those years?
Started off sort of from the skinhead scene, and at the beginning, the punks and skinheads were all going to the same shows and hanging out together, and it really wasn't political. It may have been nationalistic, but not overtly racist. And I mean, the skinhead thing goes back to the 60s in East London, and Jamaican immigrants and reggae, and so it was not racist in its origins. And ska music is certainly not racist, but in the 70s and 80s, it sort of had a resurgence out of the punk scene. But in the punk scene, there was the punks, and then there was the skinheads. The skinheads had more notoriety and generated more fear. So that's where I gravitated to have some of that. Mm-hmm. And within the skinhead scene, there was the ska skins and the oi skins. Well, the oi skins were much more fearsome than the ska skins, so that's kind of where I gravitated. Within the oi skins, there was as it started to get racist, that generated more notoriety. So I kept making these choices to the more extreme, the most fearsome place I could align myself with, and that's what I did. And once the music became overtly racist, and Screwdriver's single "White Power" in 1984 came out, and that sort of birthed the whole music genre around white nationalism and white supremacy, and that became a recruiting tool. There was concerts and all kinds of things, and so it became that white power skinhead became really a movement with the music. It wasn't really a movement per se before the music really kicked it off. And my first foray into sort of political meetings and such was more conservative organization, that was talking about immigration reform, and so I got some of the guys to come with me to a couple of these meetings, and it wasn't long before we were asked to do security at these meetings, because they'd often have counter demonstrators, and and it wasn't sort of what I heard and learned at these meetings from the speakers or the books they sold. It was the people I met there that it became a place that drew a very diverse crowd of people, an excuse for all these people to be in one room. And it was from there I got introduced to Aryan nations. It was there I got introduced to the Aryan Resistance movement, which I became leader of for a while, and we had 13 chapters across Canada as a neo-Nazi skinhead organization. And it was there that I found, it wasn't long after that I found myself down at Aryan nations in Idaho. And then the whole United States scene opened up to me, and from there was Tom Metzger and different people. And it's in 1989 I was on the Montel Williams show dressed as a skinhead. In 1991 I was on the Montel Williams show again, but then I was wearing a suit and tie, and I deemed it necessary to move out of the image of skinheads. I still listen to music, I still hang out with skinheads. But anything that I did publicly was in a suit and tie in order to mainstream the message and to play around with the Overton window.
And for anyone who doesn't know, the word Aryan, it goes back to this almost mythological idea of a white superior master race. Isn't that right?
Yeah, it actually goes back to India. The Indo-Aryans were the original Aryans that migrated west and into Europe, so the story goes. And so the sort of Persia, India area, because they refer to themselves as Aryans too. And from there, I ended up starting a white supremacist hotline that was computerized. So it was the first of its kind. You press 1 for things on immigration, press 2 for messages about the Holocaust, to generalize what they were, and had organizations from around the world. It gave them the ability to leave messages, record messages, and have people dial in and hear them. So it was pretty sophisticated at the time, but it got me into trouble with the Canadian Human Rights Commission, and went through 2 Canadian Human Rights Tribunals, and ended up in Supreme Court of Canada twice, fighting for the right to free speech. And we worded the messages so as not to violate the act. I'd met with a lawyer beforehand, and so we were, and it was no different than me being back at school, being passive aggressive and irritating my teachers. It was the same cycle that I was playing out, funny enough. And if I could get my teachers at school to lose their temper and blow a gasket with me, then that gave me a sense of power. I could hijack their emotional system, their emotional state, and cause them to explode. That gave me a sense of power over them, from that feeling of powerless. And I sort of played that same pattern out as a young adult. And so with the phone line, I went right up to the line that, of what's allowed and what's not allowed, and kind of stuck my thumb at everybody and went like that. And not that I was aware of that pattern and that provocation and the passive aggressiveness. I thought I was doing my bit for the white race. And all along this time, whether it was with Tom Metzger or older men from the other groups, I got that fatherly approval and attention. And if I think back to my childhood, and I think, what's the fondest memory I have with my dad? And my dad, when I was about 5, imported an little orange MGB sports car from England. And, we used to go on little rips on the highway, just 5 minutes from where we lived. And at that time in the early 70s, Batman was my favorite show. And, and I used to play with the old school Batmobile, and you watch the TV show and the movie, and kapow, Adam West. And, we would go on the, rips on the highway, and I would, in my mind, I would be fantasizing that, my dad's Batman, I'm Robin, and we're in the Batmobile with the top down and, ripping down the highway. And this is probably some of the fondest memories, that I have. And, I didn't realize this, too much later on in life. And, it's as part of the 1,000 hours of one-on-one and group therapy that I got through, that the Batman relationship model is inherently unequal. And for a relationship to be healthy, it has to be based on equality. And that is not an equal relationship. And so I kept putting myself in these situations where I gave my power away to, father figures and acted out for them in order to curry their attention and approval, and that drove an awful lot of the exploits that I did in the movement to generate media and generate attention. And I was quite the narcissist and quite my head so far up my ego, the things that I would do and to generate publicity, and the amount of publicity I generated was astonishing.
Yeah. Well, on Talk Beliefs, we mostly talk about cults, usually religious cults. Tony, would you say that groups such as the group you were in could perhaps be defined as a cult?
Absolutely. And I think, given many talks to the International Cultic Studies Association, and the one definition that they use to define cults is there undue influence. And cult of personality, but sometimes people create the cult of personality. The person in charge is not trying to do that, but sometimes groups of people will project that onto them. But if I think of Tom Metzger was definitely a cult of personality. There were some organizations that were more top down and they were more loose, but I think there was a code of conduct. There was, you were meant to give up friends of yours if they weren't white or if they didn't approve, and so there definitely was a lot of social pressure for conformity that happened within these groups in different ways. Each group is slightly different, and I think leaving these groups, that's another hallmark of cults is the extremes people go to when you try to leave. And I know when I was with Life After Hate, we had a volunteer. Thomas was his name, and he'd left the Aryan Brotherhood, and they made an assassination attempt on him when he was driving down the highway. Shot him. It went through his eye,
wow,
through his nose. He lost sight in one eye, 90% of the other eye. So there's always the threat of violence, or you get death threats if you don't leave on good terms, and it's very difficult to leave on good terms. So there's where it may not necessarily be intentional from the outset, but these tendencies and these behaviors and social codes and like I said, the undue influence, the difficulty in leaving, they certainly develop within these groups.
And I know that you said when we were talking before that the structure of groups such as the one you were in differs from a typical top-down cult. Isn't that right?
Absolutely. So, again, I'll go back to Tom Metzger and leaderless resistance. So, like I said, you can't infiltrate a cell if there's only one person in it. So it was small cells, giving out, anonymized information, which the internet was good for, getting that information out there, but without the look and feel of an organization with a central authority exerting control. Those personalities did exist. Tom Metzger absolutely did steer the ideological direction and set the tone for violence and acting out, and thought he could do that, with a legal shield of, I didn't tell anybody specifically to do anything, but when a group of skinheads murdered Mulugata Sarah in I don't remember the exact year, in Portland, Oregon, he was sued civilly by the family in the Southern Poverty Law Center, who got an award of $10 million against him for the actions of these skinheads who were associated with him, even though he never gave a direct order. So there was definitely, as much as they wanted to step back from it, there definitely was that influence that he had on people, and the way he was really did encourage violence, and from a distance, but he was found to be legally culpable for the actions of his followers, so to speak.
And do groups like the one you were in, do they behave in a cult-like way in the sense of relationships? Like, for instance, if you wanted to have a girlfriend or boyfriend, they would say who that would be.
They wouldn't choose who it would be, but they would choose who it wouldn't be. So, if you had, a girlfriend that was very liberal, that wasn't going to work. It's I think partners, either had to fit in with what you were doing, or they didn't fit in. So it wasn't quite as, micromanagement of relationships, but there was who you could bring around and who you could spend your time with. Everything was geared towards the concept of white revolution and saving the extinction of the white race, and there's great heroic struggle, of racial preservation that was the overarching philosophy that we sort of all paid fealty to.